In every recipe video, I try to show things that viewers will probably not have seen before. The main one here is the way in which the tomatoes are roasted in a kind of roux shell. This curry has a unique flavor that's quite concentrated, so it works best with many small side dishes, ideally in a risotto-like arrangement such as shown here. Other little dishes would include coriander mint chutney, a coconut curry sauce, seasoned yogurt, rice, and toasted papadums. Most of the Indian recipes you see online and in books and served in restaurants are from northern India, so the flavor here is going to be distinctly different from probably most anything you've had before.
And begin by melting about 22 grams of butter, about 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt, and a bay leaf. We'll put in there. Once the butter melts, I'm going to add 3/4 of a teaspoon of paprika. And as mentioned in the beginning here, you really want to use the bitter, sweet paprika explained in my cookbook series for how to make it. But you can use regular paprika; it'll still be okay. But this will be better. We're going to stir this together, cook it for about 2 minutes, just at a low heat, 2 or 3 minutes. Now I have 150 grams of tomatoes here. These are little plum tomatoes. You can use cherry tomatoes, that's fine. Putting the butter and the paprika salt mixture over these. Get rid of the bay leaf. Second here. You want to toss these and make sure that the tomatoes are well coated with this. Leave them sit like this in this for a couple of minutes before you proceed. Let the butter cool down a little bit. Make sure that they're well absorbed. Then after a couple of minutes have passed, you'll notice that a lot more of the butter mixture has been absorbed by now. Now you can add, there's no real precise amount here, just sprinkle some flour on and toss it around. You want to get these coated as evenly as possible. If you have to use a little bit more flour, that's fine. Flour's cheap. Then you set up a wire rack like this over a cookie sheet or something and just lay the tomatoes out. And there we have them. They're ready for roasting now. Then when the time is up, bring them out of the oven, let them cool at room temperature for at least 20 minutes. Gather together the ingredients for cooking lamb. I've got about 40 grams of red chilies, fairly hot, serrano, a couple of bay leaves, about 80 grams of onion chopped up, 2 teaspoons of salt. It's coarse salt, but you can use fine salt, and about a little over a teaspoon of coriander seeds. So these all get put into a pressure cooker with 1 liter of water, and then I've got about 750 grams of lamb. This is lamb with fat and bone and everything else. This would be exactly the way it would be done in a village, except it would be probably a whole animal and might be a goat. And it's not a pressure cooker. You're just gonna, if it's in a village, you're just gonna boil it in a big pot. But it'll take many hours that way. This way it'll be done fairly soon. Okay, we're gonna bring this up to a boil, then we'll put the lid on it. Okay, the steam coming off, this bubbles breaking at the surface. This is good enough. Now we're gonna put the lid on it and begin counting the time. We've got 1½ teaspoons of piecemeal or pea flour. This is made from yellow peas. It's probably an ingredient you've never seen before, but believe me, it's in every good supermarket if you look for it, even in Russia. Mustard seeds, this is about just a little over 3/4 of a teaspoon. Whole teaspoon of coriander seeds, a half a teaspoon of fenugreek, and about 1/4 of a teaspoon of asafoetida, or otherwise known as hing. We also have those roasted tomatoes that I've transferred to a bowl with most of the flour that was stuck to them. Not all of it. A little bit falls off as you move them. And we're going to add a couple of these in with the spices as they toast, as you'll see in just a moment here. I have a heavy bottom small saucepan with about 2 teaspoons, a little bit less than 2 teaspoons of sesame oil. in there, and now I'm going to add the pea flour and all the spices and a couple of these tomatoes, and we're going to begin cooking these. Heat's on medium high, about 6 out of 10. And stir it frequently, and if you have a digital thermometer, this is a Fahrenheit, keep an eye on it for it getting above the boiling point of water. So it's about 120 right now. It starts to darken around there, so stir it frequently. After 4 or 5 minutes, when it starts to darken, it's done. This is starting to turn dark now. You have to be very careful you don't burn it. This is fine. This is dark enough. Notice those tomatoes are broken down nicely. Fenugreek is toasted. It's ready to transfer to a mortar and pestle. And here we have it. Now I'm going to let this cool down a little bit before I actually begin grinding it. To the electric spice mill, we're going to put some curry leaves. It's an ingredient I rarely use, but South Indian food really needs it. You can't get them fresh. All you can get them is dried. It's a couple tablespoons of curry leaves. They're not very potent when they're dried. About a teaspoon of salt. Sambar masala from MDH is very good spice mixture for this. I'm going to use about 1.5 teaspoons of this. You can substitute regular old curry powder. It'll still be okay. But this has seasonings in it you can't buy directly, so it's better to use the sambar if you can get it. And finally, now the amount of this is the Kashmiri Mirch hot chili powder. I'm going to put about 3/4 of a teaspoon in it. You can go as much as 2 teaspoons if you want it really, really hot. You know, it's up to you. 3/4 is mild to medium. And we put the cap on, and we grind this up. And after an hour and a half, you release the pressure, transfer the lamb pieces off somewhere to cool, colander, and get any bits of spices or onion off of them. We'll clean them up more later, but obviously you got to clean them at some point. Might as well start now. Now we have this broth we have to pass through a sieve. Now let this cool down just a little bit first. Then you transfer it to the fat separating pitcher. We're going to use some of the fat and some of the broth for this. Into a bowl, I've put about a tablespoon of this tamarind paste. It's a concentrated tamarind paste. There's other ways of getting tamarind. This is the most convenient and it works the best. Plus tamarind paste, you can keep it in your refrigerator. It'll last at least a couple of years if you keep it in the refrigerator. It'll be just fine, maybe more than 2 years. It lasts a very, very long time. So we put it in a bowl like this, then we're going to decant some of this broth, this hot broth. About it, about a cup, roughly a cup. And whisk it together to dissolve the tamarind in the broth. Of course, it's important to do this while the broth is still hot, otherwise it'll be very hard to get it to dissolve. So when the meat is cool enough to handle, you need to cut it off of the bones, of course. We don't have any further use for the bones. Cut any large pieces of gristle off too. And from the fat separating pitcher, you should have had a lot more extra broth, which you can use for making rice. It's very good for just making biryani, or just, you know, you can just boil the rice with it. And you need about 1 ounce or 30 grams of lamb fat from the fat separating pitcher. And so we also have the spices that were ground here. There's the spice mill. We have the tamarind dissolved in the rest of the lamb broth. We have the tomatoes that were cooked earlier. And finally we have, in a mortar and pestle here, we have ground those spices that were fried. So as soon as I separate the meat from this and cut it up a little bit, we're finally ready to make the dish. Okay, I picked all the lamb meat off the bone. I've got roughly 250 grams of pure soft lamb meat now that's nicely seasoned. I've got 150 grams of peeled shallots, 30 grams of garlic. The 4-liter stock pot here I'm adding the lamb fat to. It's on a medium heat, number 5 out of 1 to 10. And once the oil has come up to temperature, you can add the shallots. I cut these into like half moons, and then by cutting them in half and then slicing them the other way. The exact cut isn't important, but cut them fairly small, thin. The heat's still on 5. We'll cook these for a few minutes, and we'll add the garlic next. After about 4 or 5 minutes, the shallots are translucent. Now we're going to add the garlic in, coarsely chopped. And we'll cook this for another little bit here. Okay, it's been about 2 minutes now. I'm turning the heat down to 3, and I'm going to add this ground spice mixture. This is the one with the curry leaves and the sambar and the Kashmiri merch that went through the electric spice melt. And we want to stir this until kind of a dry, cohesive mass. You have to be careful you don't burn it. You don't want it sticking and burning. But this is this toasting that it needs, and there's going to be some fond forming at the bottom, but we're going to dissolve that with the tamarind and lamb stock in just a minute here. Just mix this together for 30 or 40 seconds. That's all it's going to need. Looking pretty good. It's fairly dry, as you can see, and it's certainly not burning. Now here's the tamarind and the stock from where the lamb was cooked. Scrape the bottom up to make sure that there's nothing still sticking on the bottom of the pan. And let this actually come up to a boil. It should only take a minute or so. Okay, the heat went back up to a 5, by the way, in order to get it up to a simmer. Now I've got the rest of these tomatoes that were roasted in the oven, along with the flour and coating. And we're going to let these simmer gently for a few minutes. Okay, it's been about 2 minutes, and this flour that was on the tomatoes has thickened this up. Now we're going to add the mixture from the mortar, the ground coriander seeds and hing, and or asafoetida as it's called, and fenugreek and all that. Now this goes in. Stir that up well, and actually not finally, because we still have the sugar to add. You want to use jaggery sugar if you can, but you know, you get what you can get. Use a dark brown sugar though. Jaggery is traditional. Okay, and don't worry about it being dissolved completely right away, because it's going to have plenty of time for that sugar to mix in and dissolve. Okay, now we put a lid on it, and now we put a lid on it and reduce the heat way down to 2.
I'm very pleased to announce the release of Volume 3, The Focus on Food Chemistry. I want to clear up a few things about these 3 volumes. First, they all contain completely different information. There's no duplication, they're not revisions. When I wrote Volume 1, I had 2.5 years of YouTube videos to cover. People had been asking me for the printed list of ingredients for all of those dishes, and so I obliged. There are recipes with stepwise directions and many tips offered throughout, as well as an extensive history of Russian cuisine over the last 1,000 years, but Volume 1 is very different from Volume 2 and 3. In Volumes 2 and 3, I only had about 9 months of YouTube recipes to cover in each, so I was able to provide stepwise directions for everything. In Volume 2, I included a lot of additional information about cooking and some simple examples of flavor chemistry to set the stage for Volume 3. While Volume 2 hopefully got you thinking about some of the processes that go on in cooking and how flavors are expressed and sensed at the molecular level, the topic was painted with pretty broad strokes to make it easy to digest. Pun intended. Volume 3 is a milestone of the series, in which I've included an entire introductory course in food chemistry, which is why Volume 3 is about 70 pages longer than Volume 2. And if you just want the recipes, that's okay too. You don't have to read the first few chapters. But if you've ever been curious about what influences tastes and flavors and the rationale for deciding cooking times and temperatures and why things taste different when they're combined in different ways, this book will answer many of those questions. It also paves the way for Volume 4, which will be next year. If you want to know more about my adventures as a chef around the world and have some great laughs along the way, be sure to check out the video tour of my book, 40 Years in One Night. It's up on YouTube right now. Click the link. Also look for my cocktail book, Cocktails of the South Pacific and Beyond, Advanced Mixology, available through Amazon online.